I still remember the wave of pride that washed over me as I scribbled my signature on the lease of our first shared house. My childhood friends, Michael and Sarah, and I had always dreamed of living together, and finally, it was happening. We found this quaint, slightly run-down house on the outskirts of a sleepy town, nestled against a dense forest. It seemed perfect, or so we thought. Our first night in the new house was uneventful until I decided to take a late shower around midnight. As the steam filled the room, I couldn't shake off the feeling of unease. I heard a faint tapping noise, rhythmic and persistent, coming from the wall adjacent to the forest. Initially, I dismissed it as old pipes or perhaps branches brushing against the ceiling. Post-shower, as I made my way to the kitchen for a midnight snack, the tapping followed me, like a shadow dancing along the walls. This time, curiosity got the better of me, and I ventured outside. The backyard, bathed in moonlight, was eerily quiet, and the tapping had ceased. Nothing seemed out of place, so I headed back inside, chalking it up to my overactive imagination. The next morning, I was sipping coffee when Sarah, looking somewhat pale, asked if I heard strange noises during the night. I recounted my experience, and she shared hers, a chilling, inhuman howling around 3 a.m., emanating from the forest. Michael, a heavy sleeper, had heard nothing and was skeptical of our stories. Our skepticism was short-lived. That evening, after a day of unpacking and ordering pizza, the delivery guy, a local, casually inquired, "Heard any weird noises yet?" His question sent chills down my spine. He revealed that the previous tenant, a friend of his, often complained of bizarre, unexplained sounds at night. Michael's skepticism turned to concern. The true horror unfolded later that night. Around 11 p.m., we were lounging in the living room when the tapping started again, more insistent this time. It seemed to envelope the entire backside of the house. Fear replaced disbelief in Michael's eyes. We decided to investigate together, splitting up to cover more ground. I took the side door near the kitchen, and as I rounded the corner, my heart froze. There, crouched by the wall, was a gaunt, disheveled figure, frantically tapping against the house. Before I could react, Michael and Sarah appeared, startling the figure. He turned abruptly, his eyes wild with fear and anger. When he saw me, he let out a blood-curdling scream, the same unearthly sound Sarah had described. In a panic, we dashed back inside, locking every door and window before calling the police. When they arrived, the man was gone, but they needed only our description to identify him. He was the troubled son of a neighbor known for his psychotic episodes. He'd apparently fixated on our house, returning to it night after night. We were lucky. The lease had a grace period, allowing us to back out. Within days, we found a new place, far from that eerie house by the forest. But even now, sometimes at night, I find myself listening for that haunting tap, tap, tap against the wall. When I was about 8 years old, I lived in a sleepy village in rural Maine with my older brother Alex, who was 16. Our parents had gone out to a nearby town for the evening, entrusting Alex to look after me. Despite our age gap, we were pretty close. It was a chilly autumn night, around 7:30 p.m., and darkness had already enveloped our little house. We were in the family room, a cozy area with an old TV set and a couple of worn-out sofas. One wall of the room was almost entirely glass, with a large sliding door leading to our shadowy, forest-backed garden. The vast expanse of darkness beyond the glass always seemed a bit eerie to me, especially on nights like these. The front of the house had a small foyer with a heavy wooden door. The door had a peephole, but it was too high for me to reach. I remember the wind howling outside, creating ghostly sounds that made the evening feel even more sinister. We had just settled in to watch a movie when a news bulletin interrupted, reporting a search for an escaped convict in our area. The seriousness in the anchor's voice sent shivers down my spine. Just then, a series of loud bangs came from the front door. Alex and I jumped, our hearts racing. The house fell silent after that startling noise. We rationalized that it could have been branches from the old oak tree, often whipped about in strong winds. Huddled together on the sofa, we tried to calm our frayed nerves. That's when we heard it, the faint creak of our screen door outside. Someone had to be out there to open it. We froze. Alex crept towards the TV and turned it off, the click of the knob piercing the silence. The only light now was the faint glow from the kitchen. Time seemed to stand still as we sat there, eyes fixed on the front door. Then, turning towards the glass wall, a new horror struck us. The back door handle was slowly turning. It was locked, but we hadn't secured the deadbolt. The door rattled gently, as if someone was testing it. Suddenly, violent banging erupted on the glass door. The entire wall shook with the force, my reflection in the glass distorting with each thud. I was petrified, rooted to the spot, but Alex sprang into action. He grabbed me and we dashed to his room, barricading the door with furniture. Panic-stricken, Alex fumbled with the phone, trying to remember the number for the police. In desperation, he dialed our neighbor, Mr. Jacobs, gasping out what was happening. I huddled under the window, trembling. The terrifying ordeal ended when we saw Mr. Jacobs's truck headlights flooding our front yard. We never learned who had been at our doors that night. The next day, we found scuff marks at the bottom of the back door. We couldn't tell if they were new or old, but since then, we've never forgotten to lock every door and check them twice. That night changed everything. In the autumn of 2023, my partner Alex and I moved into our first house, nestled in the quiet town of Willow Creek. It was a charming one-bedroom cottage, a significant upgrade from our cramped city apartment. Despite the steep rent, we were enamored with its rustic charm and the promise of finally having our own space. The oddities began the night before we officially moved in. We had gotten the keys from our agent, Mr. Thompson, and had spent the day moving boxes. Planning to spend the first night in our new home, we arrived early in the morning, only to find some of our boxes tampered with. Their contents were slightly disheveled, an unsettling welcome. After a brief, fruitless call to Mr. Thompson, we shrugged it off as a mishap during the movie. Our first night was filled with the excitement of a new beginning, but the next morning, a sense of unease crept in when I found the front door ajar. I was certain I had locked it. Inside, the kitchen bore subtle signs of disturbance. The toaster was not in its place, and there were breadcrumbs scattered across the counter. Alex joked about midnight cravings, but something didn't sit right with me. As days turned into a week, these peculiar incidents persisted. Objects moved, faint noises in the night, the unsettling feeling of being watched. Finally, I decided to take action. I bought a surveillance camera from the local electronics store and set it up to cover the living room and kitchen. Then, on a chilly October night, my phone buzzed with a motion alert at 2:15 a.m. Heart pounding, I checked the feed. The sight that met my eyes was bone-chilling. A man unfamiliar and eerie was wandering our living room, heading towards the kitchen. The front door stood wide open in the background. With a mixture of fear and caution, I woke Alex, whispering about the intruder. We watched, horrified, as the man moved with an eerie familiarity in our home. I dialed 911, my voice barely above a whisper, informing the dispatcher of the ongoing break-in. The police arrived swiftly. The intruder, noticing the flashing lights, bolted towards the back door. His knowledge of the house's layout was unnerving. As officers entered the front, their colleagues apprehended him at the back. The intruder was revealed to be the house's previous occupant, Mr. Harrow. He had been evicted before we moved in and had been living secretly in the house, even before our boxes arrived. He knew every nook and cranny, using it to his advantage to avoid detection. That night taught Alex and me a crucial lesson: always change the locks when moving into a new place, no matter how safe it seems. The memory of Mr. Harrow's haunting familiarity with our home still sends shivers down our spines. After graduating from Columbia University, I decided to trade the bustling streets of New York City for the serene landscapes of Vermont. The quaint, rural town I chose was a stark contrast to the urban sprawl I was used to. Upon my arrival, I was pleasantly surprised by the warm welcome from the locals, particularly my neighbor, Mr. Thompson, and his teenage son, Jake. It was just my dad and me driving the U-Haul, filled to the brim with my belongings. Mr. Thompson and Jake noticed us struggling with a heavy dresser and immediately came over to lend a hand. While my dad and Mr. Thompson found common ground chatting about my recent graduation, I busied myself with organizing my new home. After the hard work, I expressed my gratitude to Mr. Thompson and Jake, who brushed off the thanks and insisted I call them if I needed anything else, leaving their number on my kitchen counter. My dad stayed for a while, helping me settle in, but as night fell, he had to leave. Alone for the first time in my new home, I felt a mix of excitement and nervousness. Around 10 p.m., as I was curled up on the sofa watching a thriller, a flicker of movement outside my window caught my attention. The darkness outside contrasted sharply with the light inside, making it impossible to see anything. I nervously drew the curtains, trying to shake off the unsettling feeling. I called my parents for reassurance, and their words helped calm me down. After ending the call, I realized how exhausted I was and decided it was time to sleep. In my bedroom, I carelessly left the blinds open, a decision I would come to deeply regret. As I was drifting to sleep, a sudden noise outside jolted me awake, the unmistakable sound of footsteps on the gravel outside, followed by a bright flash, sent chills down my spine. I screamed, realizing someone had just taken a photo of me from outside. I rushed to the window, phone in hand, and caught a glimpse of a figure darting towards Mr. Thompson's house. The police arrived quickly after my frantic call. Though there was no concrete evidence initially, their investigation led them to Jake, who unwittingly revealed he had just gotten home, contradicting Mr. Thompson's claim of being indoors all night. Under further questioning, Mr. Thompson admitted to his disturbing actions. Despite this confession, he faced only a minor penalty. Feeling unsafe and violated, I had no choice but to leave my dream home in Vermont. I returned to my parents' house, determined to find a safer place where I could start anew. I remember it like it was yesterday, although it happened over a decade ago. I was in my junior year of high school and found myself alone at home for the weekend. My parents were out of town for a cousin's wedding, staying overnight at a remote countryside inn, and my sister, who usually worked evening shifts at the local hospital, was on a night shift. We lived in a historic, somewhat rustic town on the west coast, known for its scenic beauty, but also for its share of troubles. As a teenager, I was pretty reserved, not really an outcast, but just someone who enjoyed solitude. This particular weekend, I was looking forward to my standard routine whenever I had the house to myself, playing video games, ordering my favorite Chinese takeout, and binge-watching horror movies. Our family dog, Max, a sturdy, calm Labrador, had been with us for nearly a decade. Max, unlike most dogs of his breed, was unusually quiet and almost indifferent to his surroundings. He never barked, preferring to spend his days lounging on the porch or silently begging for food. That night, around midnight, as I was engrossed in a particularly intense gaming session, a sudden noise from the backyard made me pause. Living in a relatively peaceful area, such disturbances were rare, so I shrugged it off as an animal rummaging through the trash. Max, however, reacted differently. He suddenly stood up, his fur bristled, and he let out a low, menacing growl, something I had never heard from him. Ignoring it, I continued my game, but a few minutes later, another louder bang echoed through the house. This time, Max bolted towards the kitchen, barking furiously, something he had never done before. His behavior was alarming, and it sent a shiver down my spine. I then realized that the sound was coming from our seldom-used cellar door, which led directly to the backyard. The realization hit me like a cold wave. Someone was trying to break in. In our neighborhood, it was common knowledge that persistent attempts at forced entry meant danger to the occupants, not just property. Fueled by a mix of fear and adrenaline, I dashed to my room to grab the old baseball bat I kept for just such emergencies. Racing back down, Max was ahead of me, his growls now mixed with sharp, aggressive barks. As I reached the top of the cellar stairs, I heard a startled exclamation from the other side of the door, followed by the sound of rapid footsteps fading away. I was too scared to call the police or even check the door. Instead, I spent the rest of the night wide awake, bat in hand, with Max vigilant by my side. When my sister returned home in the early morning, she found the cellar door barely hanging on its hinges, a chilling sign of how close the intruder had come to getting inside. Reflecting back, I'm convinced that it was Max's extraordinary reaction that night that saved me. He was more than just a pet. He was a guardian in his own right. Years later, as I had to say goodbye to him, I thanked him for his unwavering loyalty and for protecting me that fateful night. I was a grown man then, with a family of my own, but I knew deep down that none of it would have been possible without Max, my unlikely hero. The police arrived after what felt like hours, their lights piercing through my curtain. I cautiously made my way downstairs, recounting the terrifying encounter. They searched the house but found no one, and no signs of forced entry. My aunt and uncle arrived soon after, visibly upset and confused. As the police prepared to leave, one officer paused near the entrance of the ghost lounge. Curiosity piqued, he peered under the sofa, his expression turning to one of disbelief. Beneath that old dusty sofa was a horrifying collection of garbage bags, half-eaten food, and some of my missing belongings. It appeared someone had been living there, unnoticed, for who knows how long. The realization sent a shiver down my spine. The room was cleared out immediately. We replaced the old furniture with a simple table and chairs, ensuring no one could hide there again. I was off to boarding school soon, a thought that brought relief. Yet, the memory of that morning, the fear and the unknown lingered in my mind, resurfacing in the quiet, solitary moments. When I was a child, I lived in an expansive old house filled with hidden corners and forgotten rooms. Among these, there was a peculiar, narrow room tucked away at the end of a seldom-used hallway on the ground floor. My cousins, who often visited, dubbed it the Ghost Lounge because of its eerie, untouched appearance. It contained nothing but a dusty sofa, an ancient rocking chair, and a small, crooked bookshelf. One winter morning, I found myself alone at home. A heavy snowstorm had cancelled school, and my parents were stuck at their jobs in the city. The house, usually bustling with noise, was uncomfortably silent. To pass time, I decided to explore the Ghost Lounge, a place we kids usually avoided. As I was rummaging through old books on the shelf, I heard a distinct sound of footsteps above me. It was odd, but I assumed it might be just the house settling, as old houses often do. However, the footsteps persisted, growing louder and more deliberate. My heart raced as I realized someone else was in the house. Panicked, I rushed to the kitchen to grab the phone, but froze in my tracks. There, in the dim morning light, stood a tall, shadowy figure. He was dressed in tattered clothes, his face partly hidden under a hood. We locked eyes for what felt like an eternity. My mind screamed to run, but my legs wouldn't move. Finally, breaking the spell, I dashed upstairs to my room, barricading the door with a dresser. Trembling, I dialed my aunt, gasping out that someone was in the house. She urged me to call the police and stay put.